7 to 9 Celsius typically as we start off Saturday. A bright start to Saturday, some patchy cloud in the west and the far north. The rain in the north of Scotland, though, easing through the day so that most places end up brighter with lengthy spells of sunshine by the afternoon and increasingly warm. I think by and large mid to high teens for Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England, but for central and southeast England 20 to 24 Celsius possible on Saturday afternoon. Nevertheless, with the increased warmth, we're going to see an increased threat of showers starting to push up from the southwest and then developing widely across southern parts of the UK during Saturday night. Perhaps even some thunderstorms, some intense rain in places. Further showers or thunderstorms on Sunday as well as Monday, turning warmer by Tuesday.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GBNews, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. This hour we have an exclusive interview with Brexit Opportunities Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg, where he tells me that the EU is trying to punish Britain for having the audacity to leave. We'll also be in Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon has been accused of governing in secret, and we'll bring you up to date on the latest in Ukraine. Don't miss it, it's all to come after the news.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon. It's just gone 12 o'clock. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Unions are threatening national strikes over government plans to axe around 90,000 civil service jobs. The Prime Minister wants to free up billions of pounds to ease the cost of living crisis through tax cuts. During a Cabinet away day in Stoke-on-Trent, Boris Johnson told ministers to report back within a month on plans to return staff numbers to 2016 levels. Brexit Opportunities Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg says the cull will make the government more efficient.
What is being proposed is a hiring freeze. Up to 38,000 people leave the civil service every year. So over 2 to 3 years, that's how you achieve this number. And then if those jobs are essential, ministers can sign off people being moved into them so that you can continue the level of service simply with a smaller number of people.
Well, Labour's condemned the plans. Shadow Scotland Secretary Ian Murray says cutting the workforce isn't the answer to the cost of living crisis.
That is the ideas that they have to try and deal with the cost of living crisis, which is very real now and engulfing the country. Then they are out of touch and they are arrogant to the needs of the public in terms of them opening those energy bills and seeing the huge hikes, and of course opening their pay slips and seeing their tax going up, which was a decision by this Chancellor to do on the 1st of April.
The DUP is set to block the election of a speaker in Stormont when the new Assembly convenes for the first time since the local elections. The move is a protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol, which unionists say creates economic barriers with the rest of the UK. The party also says it won't nominate a Deputy First Minister, preventing a new executive from forming. Sinn Féin is accusing the DUP of holding the public to ransom over Brexit. The UK has announced 12 new sanctions against Russia, targeting President Putin's financial network, including his ex-wife and cousins. The Foreign Secretary, who's in Germany for a G7 meeting, says pressure also needs to be applied on Moscow by supplying more weapons to Ukraine. The EU has announced it's providing a further £425 million worth of military support and hopes a deal can be reached for an embargo on Russian oil. Liz Truss spoke ahead of today's talks.
It's very important at this time that we keep up the pressure on Vladimir Putin by supplying more weapons to Ukraine, by increasing the sanctions. G7 unity has been vital during this crisis to protect freedom and democracy, and we'll continue to work together to do just that.
Diesel prices have soared to a new record high despite the cut in fuel duty. Government data shows the average cost this week was 178.4 pence per litre. It means filling up a typical 55-litre family diesel car is now around £26 more expensive than it was a year ago. Rebecca Vardy has denied telling her agent to gather information from Colleen Rooney's social media account to leak to The Sun. She's giving evidence at the High Court on day 4 of the so-called Wagatha Christie libel trial. Mrs. Rooney claims her former friend leaked false stories about her private life to the media in 2019, which Mrs. Vardy denies. And the Queen, a beaming Queen, has arrived for day 2 of the Royal Windsor Horse Show. After missing the state opening of Parliament earlier in the week, there'd been speculation she might not attend the annual event. More than 500 horses and 1,000 performers are taking part in the grounds of Windsor Castle. She's attended every year since it started in 1943. It's the first major event in the Queen's Platinum Jubilee festivities, celebrating her 70-year reign. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, let's return to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Coming up this hour on The Briefing, the EU and UK relations are at breaking point over the Northern Ireland Protocol. We'll discuss this with the Conservative MP, Marcus Fish. And we will bring you my exclusive interview with Jacob Rees-Mogg, where he tells me that the government spending more would only make the inflation crisis worse.
The issue with inflation is that it is borne down upon by monetary policy tightening and fiscal policy remaining restrained. The things you can do that are positive are the supply side reforms to make the doing of business easier. The problem with spending more money is you make the inflationary problem worse rather than better.
Well, we'll bring you that interview in a couple of minutes' time. And we'll be in Scotland today too, where Nicola Sturgeon is under pressure over a ferry contract disaster. We'll get the latest from Hollywood. And give me your political briefing, of course. Send in your views and opinions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. Well, the confrontation with the EU over the Northern Ireland Protocol is intensifying this afternoon, with the EU's chief Brexit negotiator warning that Brussels will not give in to threats or blackmail. It's the latest indication that the furious row over the Northern Irish border may move closer towards sparking a full-blown trade war. Liz Truss, however, says that the UK has no choice but to act. And in another turner of events, the Democratic Unionist Party, who were forced into second place, 2 seats behind Sinn Féin at the elections last week, have vowed to paralyse Stormont until this is all sorted out. Well, joining me now is Conservative MP for Yeovil, Marcus Fish. Welcome to the programme, Marcus. I suppose the DUP are doing exactly what they said they would do in their elections, and that is to not form an executive in Northern Ireland until the protocol is sorted out. You can't blame them, really.
Well, there is no doubt that we have to sort this situation out for the sake of harmony in Northern Ireland. The reality is that the EU hasn't been reasonable in terms of its willingness to think about how the protocol can evolve according to the terms of its own agreement to smooth these matters over. And so we do have to look at what we can do to make that right.
It's interesting looking at the situation as a whole. The protocol was conceived as a notion to try and uphold the Good Friday Agreement. Yet the government is now arguing it's the protocol, that very protocol, that is in effect undermining the Good Friday Agreement. In your view, do the Americans, who have got themselves involved in this now, and the Europeans understand that's a genuine concern?
I think in some quarters there's perhaps a lack of understanding that the Belfast Agreement is very clear that the East-West strand is just as important as the North-South strand in terms of relations between the different communities within Northern Ireland. And so it does matter that a constructive approach is taken to looking at all options to minimise any restrictions on trade and traffic between that east and west axis. So it is very, it's been disappointing to see that the EU hasn't been willing to contemplate things which are very much envisaged by the agreement itself.
So if the EU continue to not contemplate not moving beyond the mandate that they gave to Maroš Sečovič in his negotiations with Liz Truss, if they simply do not budge from their pretty hard-line position, what does the UK actually do? And are we really ready to absorb the economic impact of potential trade sanctions in response to our action?
I don't think there would be any grounds for retaliatory response on this by the EU, so I think that they would be acting illegally if they did so. The reality is that what we're talking about is a very reasonable evolution of the protocol itself, with very much within the spirit of it. And importantly, from a trade perspective, it wouldn't make the EU any worse off. So there's just simply wouldn't be any justification whatsoever for any economic damage to be inflicted on the UK because of it, because there wouldn't be any economic damage to the EU or to the Republic of Ireland through this process. But essentially what we need to do is have a...
We can agree it would be an irrational move for the European Union to make, but they may well make that irrational move. What recourse would we have? Could we go to the World Trade Organization and try and sue the organisation for doing that? I mean, what on earth do we do if the EU decide that potentially not through an economic interest of their own, but simply through a desire for punishment, perhaps, they want to take that turn?
I think it would be unwise of them to do that because they wouldn't have any justification. Any reasonable person looking at it would see that what we were doing was entirely reasonable and wasn't going to damage the EU in any way at all. And I just think it would be foolish of them to go down that path, especially at a time where, you know, they are doing such questionable things, such as buying 100 billion euros more gas this summer from Russia than they were planning to before, because they're trying to fill up their storage tanks. I think the world would look aghast at them doing something silly like starting a trade war for no reason with a major partner and a friend.
And of course, it's that sort of trade war that would really affect the cost of living, something that's being really quite squeezed for so many people up and down the country at the moment. One thing I raised with Jacob Rees-Mogg yesterday when I was with him in his regional cabinet visit was the inflationary issue itself. What might have caused the inflation that we're seeing, multifaceted as it is, and what might be done to solve it. He suggested to me that the only solutions might be painful solutions, that they might only be solutions that we see the benefit of in the long term, and they may well be pain in the short term.
Well, I actually think that there are other options. I disagree with him on this. I think we need to look at things like cutting VAT rates and ensuring that people get the benefit of the price reduction. The reality is that if prices go up and you keep VAT rates the same, then the revenue collects a lot more. So there's a lot of scope, I think, for us to cut VAT rates to help keep prices down. We could do the same thing with fuel duty, do the same thing with VAT on energy. And we need to look at, for example, giving people the rebates or otherwise giving vulnerable people the ability not to have to pay the green levies that are within the energy prices that people are feeling, at least on a temporary basis. These are things that I think we have to do in order to do what we can as a government and a nation to actually keep people's experience of prices down so that interest rates don't have to be jacked up as far as they would otherwise have to be to sort of squash demand. I don't think this is a demand problem. I think this is very much a supply chain problem. I think it's a problem of underinvestment in energy sources, particularly domestic energy sources over many years now, that has meant that we don't have flexibility on some of these prices. We have to get more supply of goods and services into the economy, and we need to reform the supply side that he did mention is not just about making it more efficient for business. It's about actually getting costs down by putting more supply into the economy.
Although I suppose that supply would take time. And finally, in a word, we are running close to time. You would reject his characterisation that spending more money now would be pouring fuel on the fire of inflation.
No, what I would agree with him on that is that just subsidising higher prices keeps the prices high. What I'm talking about is let's think about it a different way. Let's actually cut taxes on VAT, income taxes, the national insurance rise, which was a mistake. Let's get rid of some of those extra taxes and use that as a way of actually keeping the prices down in the first place.
A lot of sense. Well, Marcus Fish, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Really interesting discussion there on the big issues of the day. Well, now, in an exclusive in-depth interview for GB News, I met with Brexit Opportunities Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg yesterday, and he says the EU is trying to punish the UK for leaving the bloc, no matter the consequences. During my tour of a wonderful and deliciously smelling biscuit factory, Mr Mogg said that it's not our business if the EU retaliates with tariffs due to the rising tensions over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Let's have a listen to this exclusive interview. Welcome to Elks, one of the premier biscuit factories in the UK. Inside, I caught up with Brexit Opportunities Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg to have a look at what's going on with how the government is acting with business. What did you think of the factory overall?
Well, it's part of British industry, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's automated, it's efficient, it's brilliant that it's been given a new lease of life by the takeover.
Struggling a bit with energy costs.
Of course. And energy costs are a problem for everybody at the moment. And what we've got to do is to increase our own domestic energy supply, and that means get as much as we possibly can out of the North Sea, and looking at if there are any other options that we can extract energy from.
One of those options, of course, is looking again at British natural shale gas onshore, which is being reviewed.
Which the government's committed to doing, yes. Because it's very interesting. At the moment, the wholesale price of gas has fallen very sharply in the UK, because of the imports we've had of liquid gas, and therefore there is an oversupply in the UK. So it's a mistake to think of the gas market as a global market in the way the oil market is. It's a succession of local markets depending on local supply.
The Americans have much cheaper gas because of their shale revolution, of course.
Absolutely right.
Is that something that we might be considering copying?
Well, it's certainly being reviewed. And we've got trillions of cubic feet of gas that we're sitting on. So, you know, businesses like this are very dependent. They heat every biscuit for 9 minutes. So that is an enormous amount of energy that is being used.
And they don't just heat that biscuit once, because the etymology of biscuit, going back to the Latin,
is twice baked.
Twice baked. And I wanted to ask you about twice baked, because in 2019, Boris Johnson stood with a Brexit deal that he said was oven ready. And I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Well, it depends, of course, what you mean by oven-ready, but very often if you have something that is oven-ready, an oven-ready turkey, you want to have the roast potatoes and the bread sauce, which need to be made homemade. And what we need is the roast potatoes and the bread sauce, and that's dealing with Northern Ireland Protocol, which the treaty itself says is subject to renegotiation. There is provision within the treaty to do that.
Article 13, brackets 8. But does the EU understand that that's our position?
Well, we've been making that very clear to them. If in the end they refuse to move, if they're not willing to act in good faith, then we will have to do things for ourselves. That's obviously the case. We can't accept disruption within the United Kingdom.
And clearly the government is acting as if it wants to protect the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. That's something that I believe the government really does genuinely believe. But I don't think the EU believe that the government believes it's doing that.
I don't think it's worth trying to work out what the EU believes, that becomes a rather philosophical question. I think it wants to make the UK feel bad for having left the European Union. That underpins its whole policy, and it doesn't really mind about the consequences of that. And we just have to get on with life and recognise that we've left, we've got to make our own way, we're an independent country, and what the EU wants or thinks is secondary.
Is talking over then? Have we just sort of given up on that part?
You'll have to ask the Foreign Secretary, but I think she's been saying some interesting things today, and the Paymaster General, Michael Ellis, has made a speech in Brussels today, making it pretty clear that we are, if not at the end of the road, very close to it.
And I suppose next week, as we start in that week, we may well be seeing some legislation. Is the idea that we plough ahead and we try and fix this by ourselves and don't worry so much about the consequences? Some of those consequences could affect businesses not necessarily that are importing, but that are exporting, businesses potentially like factories like these.
Well, to cancel the TCA, the European Union would need unanimity, and it seems to me that's a pretty high bar to get. And you have to say to the European Union, does it really want to punish its consumers at a time of rising inflation? And inflation in a lot of EU countries is higher than it is in the UK. They really want to make prices even higher for their consumers and their voters? I think that's an interesting, important question.
It sounds a bit like brinkmanship, and it's a strong moral argument you're making here that clearly it would be a self-inflicted wound for the European Union to whack up tariffs to try and start a trade war, even though we might not retaliate. But it does sound like we're running these 2017 to 19 arguments all over again.
Well, we can't tell the EU what to do. We have to have an idea of what it may do. And it may decide that it wants an act of self-harm. That is not under our control. But it would be a pretty silly thing for it to do. And we have to govern in our own interest, not constantly dancing around what the EU thinks or doesn't think. We've left. It's not our business anymore.
I suppose when it comes to Northern Ireland, we treat it as a special case in so many ways. Is it time potentially that the EU just accepts that there may be a bit of leakage into the single market, but ultimately British food isn't poisonous? I don't ask for checks when I have a meal in France. Do we need to be a bit more grown up here?
I went to the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic a few years ago, and I met an absolutely marvellous man in a village called Red Lion, And he said to me, it doesn't matter what you do, things will go back and forth across the border regardless. He'd been running a shop that his grandmother had set up, and borders had come and gone, but things had gone across the border back and forth in different ways, one way or another, throughout that period. And I think that sort of good common sense approach is very refreshing.
Elsewhere in the UK, there were checks to be coming in this summer. Now, you've been passionately arguing in Cabinet against those checks. Those checks have been delayed. My question to you is, why do we need those checks at all? If we're to think that we'd happily have food on holiday in the European Union, do we need SPS checks from the EU at all?
My view is we want to get rid of them, minimise them at any rate, from the rest of the world. So this is stage one, and stage two is loosening checks on New Zealand and Australia and other countries that have very high standards that we recognise. Did you know that we inspect 5% of New Zealand apples? But there's no purpose in this. It's just sheer bureaucracy, and it adds costs to consumers. So we're working towards a single trade window that will make trade with everyone more efficient. And it seemed to me it was pretty silly to put up non-tariff barriers to the EU in the hope of taking them down again in 18 months' time.
So potentially these SPS checks have not been delayed. Potentially they'll never come in.
Or they'll be different. I mean, the idea that you needed a vet to go and look at a packet of cheese wrapped in cellophane, why were we thinking that was necessary? Or tin cans had to be inspected. What were we thinking about? What was this terrible danger that was inserting itself into a tin can?
Well, let's continue this conversation a little bit outside the factory. It's got to let you get on with the talk.
Thank you. Come on, you've got to straighten that one.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think that's exactly what's happening.
Just pat them down.
The irritating thing about this is I think these are all looking perfect.
Well, they are looking pretty good.
I need to wait until I find something that's slightly out of line.
Yes, you're doing very well.
I feel like I might have messed that one up a little bit more.
You want me to reach all the way over there? Yeah, I think if I reach for that one, I might fall into the machine. And then it'll be like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. You'll have me packaged in an Asda packet.
Well, we've just got back to Euston Station after having a look at some industry in the Midlands, and Jacob Rees-Mogg looking at the issue of levelling up. This is what it really means, isn't it? We're standing here now in London that's had a lot of investment, that's had a lot of growth, but it doesn't feel like that in other parts of the country.
Well, part of it's symbolic, and that's why I think it's important that the Cabinet went to Stoke to show that we are a government for the whole of the United Kingdom, not just for London. We are a very London-centric society, so I think the symbolism is important, and I hope that we will go to more places and go to Edinburgh, Belfast and Cardiff to remind people that the Cabinet represents the whole of the United Kingdom. But you're right, Stoke has fallen behind on some measures, and it's time that it got the advantages that other places have got, and that requires government delivering a degree of opportunity for Stoke.
When you say government delivering, what does that mean? Because you ask various people what levelling up, the defining mission of this government is to level up. You talk to someone like the Tees Valley Mayor Ben Houchin, he would say it's about government getting out of the way.
It's about the government providing a ladder so that people can climb up for themselves, help them by their own effort and ingenuity to get things done, ensure that when you've got a site that needs to be redeveloped in Stoke-on-Trent, that it's not weighed down by regulations that stop it happening when an old factory wishes to become an innovation centre and have lots of other businesses there, where we were earlier on today, where the Cabinet was itself held, that there aren't regulations that get in the way of that. It's about allowing people to make the most of their own opportunities. Government can't do everything, but it can create the circumstances that allow people to do things, or perhaps it can create the circumstances which stop people doing things, and that's what you want to get away from, the negativity that you get from over-regulation and high bureaucracy.
See, when you talk about levelling up in that sense, it sounds like a coherent philosophy. It sounds like something that sort of makes sense. However, when some other people in the Cabinet talk about levelling up, sometimes it sounds a bit confused. Is it something about big, grand infrastructure projects? Is it about just simply making town centres better with more taxpayer funding? It doesn't seem like there is a big, coherent thread running through it.
Taxpayer money will not level up of its own accord. You need entrepreneurs. I met a brilliant entrepreneur earlier on today who's built his company. He told me for the first 6 months he lived off his credit card, and he's built a company up to £80 million of turnover, and he's a software engineer. And that's terrific. That just needs the government to get out of the way and let him get on with it. Infrastructure is important. There's very clear economic evidence that good road infrastructure is very important in guiding economic growth. But it's also internet connection, which allows people to connect with businesses not just in the country but around the world. And there are bits that the government can do that are infrastructure related. There are bits of expenditure, but it's pump priming and it's removing obstacles. It's not the sort of 1960s Harold Wilson, let's build a factory here because we know better than the market.
But specifically on the cost of living, these measures that we keep hearing may come about in a form of an announcement, maybe some sort of fiscal event before the autumn. What exactly is it that's being explored? We're hearing potentially a windfall tax on the table again.
You've got to be very careful about thinking what the government can do about the cost of living in terms of fiscal events. That the issue with inflation is that it is borne down upon by monetary policy tightening and fiscal policy remaining restrained. The things you can do that are positive are the supply side reforms to make the doing of business easier. The problem with spending more money is you make the inflationary problem worse rather than better. And this is very difficult for politicians because with the cost of living problem, there aren't easy popular things to do. And if you do those, you make the problem worse. So you have to do, as Margaret Thatcher showed in the 1980s, the things that need to be done. And if you explain to voters why you're doing them, what the reasoning is, and they then see the long-term benefit, that is then rewarded. But you can't take short-term expensive measures because they just make things worse.
Lots of people point to the hundreds of billions that were spent over the peak of the pandemic, that something like that could happen again. But your argument seems to be now that actually potentially some of that spending has led to some of the inflation we're seeing now.
The two things that have led to the inflation, well, there are a number of things. There's the war in Ukraine and there is the supply side issues that have beset the world. So you've got containers in the wrong ports and all of that that's been pushing up costs. But the two domestic things were the quantitative easing from 2008 and the extreme government expenditure to deal with COVID. Now that money was the right thing to do and the quantitative easing was the right thing to do, but to do either of those now would be adding fuel to the flames. So both of those have to be wound back and brought under control.
So what you're saying potentially with regards to government fiscal events of the kind that we saw over the last 2 years is unless a huge war or potentially pandemic, never again.
Well, what was done 2 years ago ensured that the structures of the economy survived. Oddly, not to have spent that money would have been even more inflationary because if you look around this station, if we hadn't had furlough, if we hadn't had bounce-back loans, every shop here would have closed. The railway would have gone out of business. So that money ensured that the economy maintained supply for when it reopened.
But
so oddly, the
that money
expenditure was non-inflationary to start with, but to continue with that level of expenditure would be extremely inflationary.
And potentially what we are experiencing now, this cost of living squeeze, is in part a consequence of that, however necessary it was.
Inevitably, if the government runs a large deficit and interest rates remain very low and there's 875 billion of quantitative easing, those add domestic inflationary pressures in addition to the global ones that have been driving this.
One of the other points of the pandemic that seems to be lasting now is a drive that you've been involved with the civil service. I'm talking, of course, about getting people back into work. It does seem that the private sector has found some pretty innovative ways to do hybrid working in 2 days out 3 or vice versa. But many government departments aren't even reaching that sort of hybrid flexibility. What is your solution other than just asking very nicely?
Well, I think asking very nicely is not a bad way to start. You need to work out what work needs to be done in the office. And we know where there are problems, don't we? There are problems with passports and there are problems with driving licences. That's very straightforward. People need to be in the office to do that. There are some things that people can do perfectly respectably from home and make that work. And there are some things where there's a bit of both. Though I'm a little suspicious that the days most people want to work from home turn out to be Mondays and Fridays. I think that tells you something, or hints at something at the very least. But civil servants have a contract. They should be expected, it's not unreasonable, that they should work to that contract.
So just finally, should that mean carrot or stick with regards to ensuring that people stick to that contract? We know it's very, very hard to let go people in the civil service as things stand.
I'm very much more a carrot man than a stick man.
What a note to end that interview. Carrots rather than sticks. I'm not sure how the civil service will think about the potential redundancies as to whether they're carrots or sticks, but we've got more of a jam-packed second half of the show for you today after we've got some messages on. But you know what? We'll be talking about Finland's proposals to join NATO. We'll be up in Scotland, where the SNP are being accused of governing in the dark. Don't miss that. And before all of that, we've got a little short break for you and the latest headlines.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle, and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon, it's 12:33. I'm Rhiannon Jones. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. Unions are threatening national strikes over government plans to axe around 90,000 civil service jobs. The Prime Minister wants to free up billions of pounds to ease the cost of living crisis. Downing Street hasn't ruled out compulsory redundancies, but it's hoped lots of cuts will occur through natural attrition.
Come forward and give the undertaking and sign a roll of membership, please.
The DUP says blocking the election of a Speaker to the Northern Ireland Assembly sends a message to the EU and the government that the post-Brexit trading agreement isn't working. Leader Sir Geoffrey Donaldson also says the party won't nominate a Deputy First Minister, preventing a new executive from forming.
If the European Union is serious about protecting the political institutions and the Belfast Agreement and its successor agreements, the basis of political progress and stability in Northern Ireland, then they know what they need to do. And equally, the same message is there for our own government as well.
The UK has announced 12 new sanctions against Russia targeting President Putin's financial network, including his ex-wife and cousins. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, who's in Germany for a G7 meeting, says pressure also needs to be applied on Moscow by supplying more weapons to Ukraine. Boris Johnson will meet Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe in Downing Street today after her release from detention in Iran. It'll be the first time the former British aid workers met the Prime Minister since her return to the UK, having been held captive there for 6 years. And the Queen has arrived for day 2 of the Royal Windsor Horse Show. More than 500 horses and 1,000 performers are taking part in the grounds of Windsor Castle. It's the first major event in the Queen's Platinum Jubilee of festivities, celebrating her 70-year reign. TV Online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. It's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Welcome back. Now, in the spring statement in March, Rishi Sunak announced that he would aim to cut the basic rate of income tax from 20p to 19p in the pound by 2024. Now, that's not a 1 pence cut, that's a 1% cut, although sometimes people get confused. But MPs and groups have called for this big tax cut to be brought forward amid the rising cost of living. And in other news, today the Prime Minister has announced that up to 91,000 civil service jobs could be cut in an effort to save £3.75 billion every year. Well, joining me now in the studio to talk through this cost of living issue is Danielle Boxall from the Taxpayers Alliance. Welcome to the programme. I mean, we've been hearing a lot about the cost of living, about rising inflation, about problems, about solutions, and which solutions may become problems in the future. How do we make sense of it all?
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of talk about tax and spend at the moment, and for all, Rishi's credit, he says he's a tax-cutting chancellor, but quite frankly, I don't see it. I mean, we're having these stealth taxes in the freezes to thresholds for income tax, other thresholds as well. It's good that he raised the NI threshold from about 9,000 to 12.5, so it's in line with income tax. But quite frankly, it's just not enough. I mean, going ahead with the national insurance rise was a bit of a kick in the teeth for taxpayers, really. We've got a 70-year tax burden, and the tax take is actually at a record high. So it's not like the Chancellor doesn't have wriggle room to actually make those tax cuts and help people today when they really need it in this cost of living crisis.
I suppose this is the pernicious sort of evil of inflation. Governments, in some ways, quite like it. They get bigger receipts. The VAT receipts go up. And without them doing anything, they sort of inflate away the national debt. Good for governments, really horrible for the people living under those governments. Would this income tax cut being brought forward, it would clearly put more money in the pockets of people in work. It wouldn't put more money in the pockets of people on benefits, and it might not do anything to alleviate those price rises that we're seeing.
It might not do anything to alleviate the price rises, but it will help shield people, from having less money in their back pockets overall. So, it'll give people a bit more money to work with and help them with the cost of living crisis that they're seeing at the moment. And, of course, as you mentioned, the interest rates are going up and inflation is causing that, which also means that debt payments are going up too, right? So the Chancellor is going to have to pay off a bit more in debt, and it's, I think, inflating to the size of government departments now. So there is a lot of pressure on the national purse at the moment to get it right. And I think putting more money in people's back pockets is the right thing. Boosting growth, of course, as well, which is really good for the economy when we're seeing quite a stagnant economy at the moment. I mean, yesterday's figures were a lot lower in terms of growth than what was expected. So I think growing the economy and boosting jobs by pushing this income tax forward would be really helpful to the prosperity of the country as a whole.
There's a real worry, though, if this is an inflation that becomes, rather than a cost push, but a demand pull form of inflation, where there's a lot looser monetary policy, people have more cash is printed or given out or whatever, and that sort of pushes the prices up. There's a worry that actually a lot of the solutions that make things better for people might just push prices up further.
Yeah, but we've seen that in the past, that things like that are quite dangerous. So I think by increasing by reducing the income tax, I think that will actually really help people right now, which is when people need it. And we're seeing this cost of living crisis is already hitting with bills going up. Let's not forget people's biggest bill they're going to pay in the year is their tax bill. So I think in order to really help people when they're struggling, this is the right thing for the government to be doing.
One other thing that we've been hearing that the government may be doing is reducing the size of the civil service. It's extraordinary that it's expanded by almost 100,000 people in the last 5 or 6 years alone. How feasible is it, and how realistic is it to reduce the size of the civil service? We know that it's an organisation controlled by some pretty persistent unions that do not like redundancies.
Yeah, and of course, no politician wants to be implementing job cuts, but I think it is the right thing to do. I mean, the wage bill of the civil service is absolutely astronomical, and that's just not the wage bill. There's a pension bill as well. Public sector pensions are one of the most generous around, so that is a massive burden on the taxpayer. So I think by making savings elsewhere, by cutting jobs, it is really going to help with the overall tax and spend debate that we're seeing at the moment and really provide some savings so that they can go ahead with these tax cuts that they are promising.
So this is where it could help the cost of living, because it does seem very abstract to a number of people. How would there being fewer civil servants sort of help me with my day-to-day shop or whatnot? This would be saving money on some things the government does to ease up the burden on other things and potentially leave people with more of their own cash.
Yeah, of course, and we've seen this coming for a long time. I mean, Simon Clarke said recently that, this is unprecedented level of civil servants and that they do want to reduce it, so it's not like it should be coming as a surprise. But yeah, I do think it is going to be very helpful. I mean, the government's announced that they want to see £5 billion worth of savings by tackling wasteful spending. We see wasteful spending on a day-to-day basis. I mean, last year we did a project with the Daily Mail. We found that there was over £5 billion of waste every year. So, and that was just, a small project that we did. So there is a lot of waste in government, there is a lot of wasteful spending, and that money could be used to provide tax cuts to help those that really need it right now.
Well, really, really interesting stuff. Let's hope that some people in government have been listening and potentially taking some of those ideas forward. Daniel Boxall, thank you so much for joining us there. Now, next up, we'll be talking about Scotland and the SNP's scandal-hit ferries contract. But before then, a short break.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. You're listening to, or indeed watching, The Briefing. Now let's turn our attentions to Scotland, where Deputy First Minister John Swinney is under pressure after it emerged he gave the green light to the SNP's bungled ferries contract that's cost taxpayers at least £240 million. It came as the Scottish Government was accused of treating Holyrood with contempt after announcing that a lost document had been found at the bottom of an email folder. The document, which was released, did not explain why the Scottish Government thought it as appropriate to overrule every recommendation it was given regarding this ferry contract, which has sparked accusations of a culture of secrecy at the heart of Nicola Sturgeon's government. Now, it's worth mentioning that, as usual, we asked the Scottish Government to put up a representative on today's show, but, as usual, they declined to do so. One wonders, what do they have to hide? Well, let's bring in now Scottish Conservative MSP Jamie Green to talk through this instead. It's a shame that we couldn't get anyone from the Scottish Nationalist Party to talk through this, but let's get your perspective, because, of course, this is a scandal that has been brewing for quite some time, although hasn't made it that large in the UK-wide press. Can you give us a rundown of exactly what's taken place?
Goodness, how long is your show? This would take a couple of hours, I'm afraid, but I'll try and be brief. Yeah, I mean, it's not a surprise that no one from the SNP would come and talk to you to defend their position, because they've got a lot to defend. The whole episode really is just shameful. It's bizarre. I mean, it really is like something out of the thick of it. You couldn't make up the incompetence of what we're seeing at the heart of the Scottish Government here. What we're talking about principally was a contract awarded for 2 new ferries to work in the Scottish Island ferry network. That's a publicly owned ferry network, and they are in desperate need of new ferries. We have very harsh weather conditions, and our island communities are cut off from the mainland. Scotland has many large islands which are so reliant on the ferry. It really is a true lifeline service for them. This contract goes as far back as Alex Salmond, really, to be quite honest with you. And it's very clear that it's been nothing but corrupt and erroneous from the very start. We've been, over the years, I sat in the previous Parliament committee, which did a big report and inquiry into this, and we unearthed, as far back as 5 years ago, problems with this contract. At the end of the day, the ferries are yet to be delivered. They will be at least 5 years late. And as you mentioned, they will be costing the taxpayer about £250 million and counting. That's for 2 small ferries.
And this
it's unbelievable.
Is about the SNP overriding recommendations, official recommendations, in favour of handing out these contracts to people that simply weren't up to the job.
Yeah, I mean, we all want to see a thriving shipbuilding industry on the Clyde, the area that I represent. We have a long, proud tradition of that. But what you need at the heart of that is a government that knows what it's doing. In contrast to the UK government, which actually gets on with building ships in Scotland, the SNP simply hand out contracts to yards at the time, one of which was owned by a very large donor to the independence movement, Kelsey. So, we really don't know why the government went against the grain of legal advice or professional advice. And now we're trying to uncover who actually signed off the contract in the first place, despite the lack of, these reassurances around insurance and making sure that the public taxpayers' money would be protected if all went wrong, and it all has gone wrong. That's the problem. Now, I've been to the yard many times, and I've seen progress, albeit slow progress, on the ships. And I do want to say that the workers there are doing their level best to get those ships built. But what we have at the heart of it is an incompetent government who doesn't know how to award contracts, can't oversee large infrastructure projects, and puts their head in the sand when anyone raises it. I mean, it's an utter disgrace, actually. The taxpayers should be furious.
Can't even say who handed over, who signed off these contracts. There's one report that the SNP have been trying to pin this all on the disgraced former Minister Derek Mackay, of course, although they haven't produced any evidence as to such.
Yeah, I mean, if I was, Derek Mackay was a government minister at the time, no longer in the Parliament. If I was him, I would be livid right now because they're pinning the blame on somebody who's no longer in the Parliament. Oh, well, that's very convenient for Mr John Swinney, who is our Deputy First Minister in Scotland, who was the then Finance Secretary. Trying to follow the paper trail, it's not just us that are having problems with that. Audit Scotland themselves, an independent body, is having problems with it. And they've been criticising the government all the way through this process. They're telling us that documents are missing, they can't find them, they don't know where they are. And then we called a debate this week to the Scottish Parliament about the ferry fiasco, and all of a sudden the minister stands up and says, look what I found at the bottom of my inbox. There's the missing document, it's magically appeared. The problem with the missing document is it doesn't even answer the question, and that's who made the decision and why. Why was legal advice ignored? This was a high-risk contract, we all knew that from the beginning. Who decided to give it the go-ahead? There had been a catalogue of errors all the way through this. And let's not forget that the end result means that our island communities have ferries which are breaking down on a daily basis, and it's just becoming a farce.
Well, Jamie Green, thank you so much for talking us through that issue. It's such an important one, and no doubt one we will return to in some time. Thanks for joining us. Now, moving on, the German President Olaf Scholz has accused Russia of weaponising energy. Yesterday, Russia cut some supplies to Gazprom, which marks an escalation in the Kremlin's threats to cut off energy supplies to Europe. This comes as Germany has been forced to pump in extra gas from Norway and the Netherlands as Ukraine authorities have shut down a pipeline which has been used previously to carry Russian energy to Europe. Well, joining me now is Germany correspondent Thomas Sparrow. Welcome to the programme, Thomas. This seems like the most extraordinary story, although potentially one that in many ways it's surprising it hasn't come sooner. So much energy flowing through Ukraine, an active war zone, and now suddenly this.
Well, from the German government's perspective, from the German Chancellor's perspective as well, this is another proof that Russia is planning to use energy as a weapon in order to basically put more pressure not only on Germany but on other European countries to move in one way or another. At the same time, the German Vice Chancellor and an energy minister as well, he stressed that from an energy point of view, those cuts that Russia has announced are rather small from all the percentage that Germany imports from Russia on a yearly level. It's also important, just as a matter of context, to stress that Germany's dependence on Russian gas has certainly decreased considerably since the war began. Pre-war, it was around 55% of imports, and now, according to official German figures, it's around 35%. So it's more of a political measure than an energy-related measure, this according to German officials. And by the way, we're also hearing just now, this is news that had just come in, that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke on the phone to President Putin this morning. It was a 75-minute talk. And although from the readouts, it was mostly about a ceasefire in Ukraine, about political talks, it is very probable that they also discussed all these political and economic issues related to gas.
Has Germany committed to squeezing out Russian supply entirely from its energy supply?
Yes, and that's something that, by the way, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock stressed as a key goal only a few days ago when she was visiting Ukraine, basically stressing that Germany is planning to cut its dependence entirely. That is nothing that will happen immediately. That's also something that German officials have stressed on various occasions. And by the way, that's also something that a majority of Germans favor. If you ask a majority of Germans, they have said in various polls that they would like a gradual reduction of Germany's dependence on Russian energy. We're not only talking here about gas, but also oil and coal. They do not want an immediate cut. So in other words, a majority of Germans is not necessarily in favor of an immediate embargo, but they do see the point, they do see the need of Germany reducing its dependence on Russian energy, and they want that to happen in a gradual way so as to prevent Germany suffering even more from an economic perspective. As you know, prices here are very high. As you know, inflation here is also growing, and as such, what German officials are trying to do is make sure that sanctions that are imposed against Russia do not necessarily affect Germany too much as well.
Yes, I suppose that's always the trouble with sanctions. They do bite both ways. Well, Thomas Sparrow, thank you so much for talking us through that important issue for us here on The Briefing this afternoon. Now, sticking with Russia, Russia has said that it will be forced to take retaliatory steps over its neighbour Finland's move to join NATO. And joining me now to discuss this is former British Army officer Stuart Crawford. Stuart, welcome to the programme. I suppose this is entirely why the United Kingdom has signed new defence accords with Finland and with Sweden, because the time between which you say you're joining NATO and the time you actually do sign on the dotted line, you're incredibly vulnerable.
Yes, I think that's correct. We can speculate for the reasons that Russia invaded Ukraine. I think one of them was probably the fear that Ukraine was going to join NATO. And that seems less likely now because any negotiated settlement there is likely to rule that out. But I think that Finland and Sweden obviously have taken the lesson from their vulnerability, have decided or will decide, I think this Sunday Sweden will decide to whether to apply to join NATO or not. And in the meantime, we have this new defence arrangement with the United Kingdom, which basically makes their position much more secure. As far as NATO is concerned, Finland's accession would secure the northern flank, and it would be a great boost to NATO defences in the west.
Indeed, it would double NATO's border with Russia. Has Vladimir Putin, in his ambition to try and stop NATO expansion, actually scored an own goal, strengthened NATO where he wanted to weaken it?
I think that's exactly right, Tom. I mean, one always has to think of the second and third order implications of any actions that one chooses to take. And he obviously, I presume, did not imagine that it would have this effect. But he has indeed scored an own goal. And two nations which have been militarily sympathetic to NATO but not actually part of it, now look as if they're going to join, which advances, if you like, NATO's borders again closer to Russia. So he's in many ways hoist by his own petard, I think.
It's interesting looking at what Russia possibly could do. It seems like there's an emerging stalemate in Ukraine. The Ukrainians advancing in some areas, the Russians advancing in other areas. Is this just now the situation in Europe? Russia looking a little more isolated, but digging in. Where does this move from here?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that Russia has been weakened by its military adventurism in the Ukraine, not just militarily, but also economically and reputationally, which is always important on the international stage. I don't think there's any chance in the short term that Russia will try to invade any other country because it's completely bogged down in Ukraine. And as the war progresses, Russia gets weaker in Ukraine, the Ukrainians get stronger. And at some point, Ukraine will go onto the offensive in an attempt to regain lost territory, which could include Crimea as well, depending how well they find themselves supplied.
Well, that is remarkable. Were the Ukrainians to push through into Crimea, this would be an entirely counterproductive war from the Russian point of view. I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme here, but really interesting stuff there. Thank you so much, Stuart Crawford, former Army officer, for joining us here on The Briefing this afternoon. Really appreciate your time. Well, you've been watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, this afternoon. The show's back every weekday from 12 p.m. Up next, it's Liam Halligan with On the Money, but for now, I'll be leaving you with your weather forecast. I hope it's sunny.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule